under the Arrow Cross uniform, they found his Hebrew prayer book. So it was quite obvious that he was not one of those Arrow Cross guys. So, as I said, Pest was liberated, and I was hoping that my family will come for me. But only my aunt came, and to ask that the couple can keep me a little bit more, because my mother was in a very bad shape at that time, uh, after losing my father, and they felt that I would be safer there. The streets were still terrible, horses on the road. So anyway, so I personally got together with my family only after February.
Several months later.
Yeah, only in February, and
Back in your original apartment?
no, 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 no. You couldn't go to Buddha.
Okay.
We were all at my uncle's Tibor apartment in Lipot Város, Lipot district, and we all lived there. You couldn't go to Buddha because there were no bridges. The Germans blew up all the Budapest bridges, and also they were still fighting.
Mm-hmm.
So we were quite all right with my uncle. He was a dentist, as you know. My aunt was a dentist too. So the Russian soldiers stole a lot of gold, and they came to the dentist to have their teeth kept with gold. And because my grandfather spoke Russian, I mentioned it that he was in Russia
Mm-hmm.
uh, for 8 years. It was a very good communication. He was even able to sing for them the International. So we lived there for quite a long time until we were able to cross on a makeshift bridge to look up our apartment, but our apartment was totally bombed out. Um, Actually, not completely because the bomb stopped on our floor. We lived on the third floor, and the fifth floor library was on our floor. So after after we were able to go, we were able to find a little place there on the ground floor to stay. And incidentally, that's how I learned that my father died. They forgot to tell me. In under commotion, we went back to the building, and the janitor, who was hiding our things, told my mother that, "Oh my Mrs. Gunsey, I am so terrible sorry to hear your losses." And that's I looked around, and that's how I learned that my father died.
And did you also then learn as well over a period of time that the rest of your family so much? Like, when did people learn about
Oh,
your
that
uncles?
was much later.
Much later?
That was much later. And then we had my parents had a very, very good friend who, after liberation, because the Russians really liberated us, uh, he had a pattern, some industrial pattern in Switzerland.
A patent?
Patent, yeah.
Yes, okay.
In Switzerland, and all of a sudden in a few months, he became a millionaire, a real millionaire. And because my father was giving him help before the war with this pattern, uh, well, not, it was financial help and
Legal.
legal.
Do you know what the patent was?
Something to do with textile industry, but I really don't know.
Mhm.
All I know that he became a millionaire, and he felt obliged to help to build up, to renovate our building, our apartment. So that's how we got back to our apartment.
Obviously, it took a long time, though.
I am sure it did. We lived on the ground floor for a while, but I don't remember how long. That I don't know. And
Did life return to normal? You went to school.
yeah, I started school in September. As by that time we were back in our apartment, not on the third floor, but and in the same apartment building. And I started second grade. I never went to first grade, so I didn't miss a year. And by that time, it was there was a lot of problems, but not for a child. There was a absolute runaway inflation in Hungary that, of course, my mother must have suffered a lot. Like, she got paid 2 trillion forint, and then she went shopped whatever she was able to buy food, because the next day it was 5 trillion.
Mhm.
So it was totally ridiculous.
So she still had to manage getting money on, food on the table,
But
those sorts of
she
things.
started working in different. She had no profession. She was a housewife,
Mhm.
and she started all kind of menial work, and but everybody was helping in. My grandfather stayed with us, and so there was no problem babysitting. My great aunt came over to cook for us. At that time, my grandmother was still alive, so everybody was chipping in to help my mother. Not to mention my uncle Tibor, who was officially a guardian and who gave the most financial help. And I had a pretty happy childhood after that.
So can we switch over to Gabi
Yeah.
and what you know of his war
What I
experience?
know of his time during the war, that he was luckier than myself. He, the building where he was living, first of all, it was in the Jewish district to begin with. Then it became the Jewish house, so he stayed in his own apartment. All the relatives, of course, moved in with them, which was crowded and unpleasant, but at least they stayed in their regular home. And later on, that building became a Swiss house and the Sweden house. That means that the Sweden house, Wallenberg came to help, and he gave, how should I say, those buildings were under the Swedish government protection. Where Gabi lived, the building became under Swedish protection. Wallenberg, the famous Wallenberg, was trying to help the Jews of Budapest Unfortunately, by that time, Wallenberg was only able to save the Budapest Jews, and he went. He was absolutely heroic. How he took people from the train, and but also had houses that was protected by the so-called Swedish government. There was also the same effort by the Swiss, and the Portuguese ambassador was also giving out papers. So anyhow, Gabi was there. He had one incident that was very dangerous. That despite of the Swedish protection, the aerocross came in and wanted to get the children out from the building, and Gabi and another boy was hiding in their neighbors under the bed when they were Christians and they were long-time neighbors, and she was hiding the two boys under the bed. And that was a very dangerous 5-10 minutes. But fortunately, they were able to hide. And that was the only incident really for him.
So he was able to stay there the whole time.
He was there all the time, yes. He was, as I said, he was luckier in that respect.
I do remember him talking about the food shortages, though.
Very short in food, but what he said was, and I have to say that for myself too, that there were all grown-ups around us, and for the grown-ups the most important thing was that we have enough. So we always had enough. They were always trying to feed the kids first.
So they were sacrificing.
So we were. I personally, I am not saying that I was ever starving. I had bad food, okay, but not starving. And so the same thing for Gabi.
So the family that came and stayed with him, do you know?
Grandparents, uncles, the same. The families were living together. Extended family, as they say here. Yeah?
Yes. When did Judy Bachi go to the labor camps?
Judy Bachi was also in the my father-in-law was also in the labor camp, and he also escaped, but only after the war he came back. It took him quite a few months to. Well, they were all coming from Russia. And as Gabi was telling me, all of a sudden, someone was yelling on the corridor that, oh my God, it's Judy Siklos who is here. It's Judy Siklos. And Gabi's mother fainted. It was such a. Don't forget, by that time she knew that three of her brothers were dead.
Yeah. So and maybe we should explain, when you say the Russian, it was because he was a laborer.
He was also in the
Germans.
labor battalion with the Hungarian army in Russia.
Fighting against the Russians.
Fighting against the Russians, right. Of course, yes. And then
digging trenches, roads, doing everything,
yes.
And suffering, obviously, in the cold.
Yeah. He was very skinny. He was, but he was alive. And that was way after the war, when he came back. So his life was, in that respect, less interrupted. It's very unfortunate that his mother died very shortly after from a heart attack. So
No, she also had diabetes too, didn't she?
No, she didn't have diabetes. In the family,
Okay.
there were people diabetic, but as far as I know, she didn't.
She didn't. Okay.
She didn't. So that's really what I know about Gabi's story in the war because it's not very long.
Okay.
That was the advantage of living in the Jewish area, and
Staying in your home.
yeah, yeah.
Okay. One of the items you wanted to speak about was some of the Zionist camps that were operating at that time.
Yes. So the war ended in April, and we were, of course, very delighted, liberated. But unfortunately, as I mentioned before, there were inflation, there were food shortages, and the Zionist movement, mainly from the United States, uh, organized camps for orphan Jewish children. I was half orphan, but Aniko and I went to a Zionist camp to one of Hungary's most famous cities, Szeged, about 150 kilometers away from Budapest. Unfortunately, the trip lasted 2.5 days. I'm just mentioning that how difficult everything was after the war to get back to normality.
Okay.
In the camp, they were we had a fairly good time. My sister hated it.
Why did she
I
hate
sort
it?
of
Do you remember
didn't
why?
mind it. I didn't mind it
Do you know why your sister hated it?
because by this time my sister was a very religious Catholic,
Okay.
and she resented the fact that in a Zionist camp, surprise, surprise, they were teaching Zionist songs, and they were trying to get us to go to Palestine at that time. So
Were there other people that, like Aniko, who through the Catholic Church trying to help, through the nuns and things like that, and through being baptized, that they legitimately converted to Catholicism or
yes,
Christianity?
yes. Older children mainly, like Aggie, if you remember, she also had a phase of being a religious Catholic. I was not affected, and I personally can say that if you are prone to this kind of mystic belief, then Catholicism is very good for you. But unfortunately, I'm not. So even as a child, I I sort of turned back to Judaism as such,
The culture.
as a culture, as a tradition.
Right.
And also, older children like my sister, it has left, being Jewish was a horrible connotation for them after what we went through.
You mean the consequences of being
The
Jewish?
consequence, and they felt that being Jewish is shameful. I never felt it myself, but this is
Mm-hmm.
what happened to some of them.
So at the camp,
So in the camp, my very famous incident was that after the war, in a camp, we had lice, and so they marched us together and went into the town, and without explaining it to us, they just totally cut off our hair. But I mean,
shaved it.
they totally shaved our hair.
Oy. Aniko included?
And when I got back, I looked in the mirror. I was so upset that I had fever, and I was absolutely shocked. And to this day, I actually hate haircut. I have to love the hairdresser to make myself go there.
Alas,
I know you're laughing, but it is true. It is true.
So
Other than that, in the camp, we learned songs, and I basically had a good time.
it was a normal camp, except there was a Jewish
normal camp
spin.
under the circumstances, yes.
You were well fed, though. That's the important thing.
We were fed, not fancy food.
No, camp
But
food.
we had more food than, let's say, would have stayed in the city. Because food was very scarce in Budapest.
So for how long a period of time?
That was a few, maybe, I don't remember exactly. I mean, a 6-year-old,
Yeah, yeah.
it looked like eternity, but I have no idea.
Right.
Tell you honestly. But even when I started school, my hair was about this thick, and I felt ashamed about it.
I'm assuming your sister was even more upset.
So that was not my very good experience.
Aniko must have been even more upset because she was an older girl.
I don't remember her.
No.
I was busy with myself, to tell you honestly.
Okay.
I have to admit, I am very honest about
How
it.
did your mother react when she saw you?
My mother was actually there working in the kitchen.
Oh,
So, well, she was trying to comfort me, of course, but I was
so she
devastated.
was. So you saw your mother even though
I
you were
saw
at
my
camp.
mother sometimes, not very often, but sometimes.
But that must have been
Yeah.
comforting then.
Yeah. So that was my experience with the Zionist song. And we were, at that time, we were really, truly happy to see the Russian soldiers there. They were all over.
So was this the summer of 45?
45, yes.
Okay, so it was
The
right
summer
after.
of
Right
45,
after.
and we were really, really very happy to see the Russians. Of course, later on I heard that the Russian soldiers did horrible things to raping women, looting, stealing, but as a child I did not feel it. I just knew, and everybody was telling me how wonderful it is to be free.
Yeah.
And at that time there was an idea that now Hungary will be a free country. And there was an election in 1946 where there was a democratic election, and quasi center-right party won the election very legitimately, and so we felt that it will be, everything will be all right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it didn't last very long.
How long?
The next election in 48 was when the Communist Party stole the election.
Okay.
There was no question about it. Everybody knew. They won the election with the Social Democrats. And right after they formed the government, they kicked out all the Social Democrats, and basically that's when the show trials started
Okay.
in Hungary, and those days started to be very bad. All the old communists who were really honest communists from the 30s were kicked out of the party, and the whole regime became dictated by
Stalin.
Moscow.
Yeah.
Moscow, Stalin. And by that time, in 1948, I was already 10 years old. And because one of the show trial was involving my family too, I already knew what was going on.